Today's presentation will be given by Pauline Li, Associate Professor of Chinese Religions and Cultures at St. Louis University. Professor Li received her AB from Stanford, her MTS from Harvard Divinity School, and her PhD from Stanford University. She teaches East Asian religions and philosophy with courses in Chinese thought, Confucianism, Taoism, East Asian women and feminism, Chinese civilization, and children's studies. Her first monograph, Li Zhi, Confucianism and the Virtue of Desire, examines the 16th century thinker Li Zhi and his views on the role of self-expression and desire in a good life. With Rivi Handler-Spitz and Hans Saucy, she has published the first book-length English language translation of Li Zhi's writings, A Book to Burn and A Book to Hide, just out from Columbia earlier this year. And this translation will be followed soon by a volume of critical essays on Li Zhi by the same team. Professor Li's current book project, provisionally entitled Play in China, The Trifling, the Wicked, and the Sacred, examines changing views of play in China from 200 to 1800 CE through a study of Chinese religious and philosophical classics, the rich but too often neglected tradition of commentaries on these works, as well as paintings and playthings. Today she'll be speaking on native seeds of change, writing and reading women into the tradition. Please join me in welcoming Pauline Li.
Thanks, David. Oh, thanks. This is a wonderful audience, and I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation to come speak here at the Center for China Studies, and thank you to Ina Schlor for organizing it. Today, I'm going to speak on, it's a project I've gone, can you all hear me? Yes. Okay. So it's a project that I started a long time ago, and then I've left it aside and then gone back to it and decided that there wasn't any more to do with it. Now I think back, there was a book that came out in 2013, and so I've gone back to this project. And it's, what I want to argue today is that we do still need to use this category, native Chinese feminisms, and it's helpful for us to use that category. It's useful, it's productive, at least for now, to use that category to retrieve what's special and distinctive about arguments for women's agency that you find in traditional China. Or in other words, what I want to argue for is I want to argue that it's useful, at least at present, whatever the problems with it, it's useful to use that category, Confucian feminisms. And I want to use a particular case study, and the person I'm using is someone that it's convenient for me to use it, which is Li Zhi, because I've been translating his works for quite some time. So we're going to look at him as just a case study for this idea that there's such a thing as it's helpful to think about a Chinese feminisms and try to describe what's distinctive about Chinese feminisms. So here at University of Michigan, there's been, well, there's quite a bit, there's substantive work done on Chinese feminisms in the modern period. And a lot of the really good work is here done at University of Michigan or in collaboration with others, but also here at University of Michigan. I'm not going to be looking at the 20th century. I'm taking us back again to the 1500s and looking at this person, Li Zhi. And again, the question I'm asking is, what does a Confucian feminism, what does it look like? So I'm going to begin with a starting point, which is, I want to look at this book that came out in 2013, just for a minute, just for a second actually, just as a starting point. So there's a book that came out by Lydia Liu, Rebecca Carl, and Dorothy Coe, and I was so excited to see it. It's called The Birth of Chinese Feminisms, and some of you have probably read it. And one primary task in this, it's a path-breaking and excellent book, is to move beyond they say, the Western or male problem of origins for Chinese feminism. So to look beyond just the male, the idea it comes from men, or it comes from the West, or it comes from liberal philosophy, or Enlightenment philosophy, to go beyond that and to look for, to study Chinese feminisms by bringing to light the writings of this female Chinese feminist dating from the late 1800s named He Yingzhen. It's, again, it's this excellent, it's a great contribution. I want to pick on just one point, not to pick on things, But I want to pick on one point simply to highlight why I think that it might still be productive to use and useful to think in terms of a native, specifically for me here, Confucian feminism. So the authors describe Li Zhi as, they write, debunking the millennial-long classical textual scholarship and Confucian commentarial traditions. And they write that she engages in a totalistic rejection, so it's from the text, totalistic rejection of Confucianism. But when I read through the essays from Li, my view was that she's rejecting Confucianism no more than is this person I want to look at today. So our subject of study for today, the 16th century Ming iconoclast Li Zhi. And I'm going to argue that he effectively argues for women's agency by working cleverly within the millennia-long classical textual scholarship and the Confucian commentarial tradition. So he's making these arguments by working within. And when I looked at Li Zhi's, my thought was that she actually does too. And when we forego that concept of native or Confucian feminisms, we overlook or we bury what's some of these very interesting, important, significant elements in her feminism, or I'm speculating in other texts too. So again, that's why I'm arguing it's important, or it's significant, useful at least, to use that category. So I'm going to argue that in the case of Li Zhi, we find one strategy for attaining gender equality, or women's agency, that takes seriously tradition and culture. So Confucius says, this culture of ours. And Li Zhi works as a Confucian, as you would expect. So he takes seriously tradition and culture and the power of reading and writing, rather than, for example, if you think of contemporary feminist discourse, rather than legal change, rather than activism or changes in the social structures. He takes seriously reading and writing and those strategies, which is what a Confucian would do so well, and he does. He does that to affect our hearts and minds and substantively transform our lives. So what we find in Li Zhi then is, I want to say, though, when I say it, I say it and then I get pushed back on it by myself too, from myself, but I want to call it a Confucian feminist strategy. And I think it's a distinct and powerful resource that we can offer that contributes to contemporary feminist discourse. So it's not just that there is such a thing, but it has something important to offer to contemporary feminist discourse. Okay, so again, Li Zhi is just a case study for me. It's a convenient one because I've been translating him. And to say a little bit about him, in shorthand, so for those of you who know him, he's a 16th century late Ming, sometimes Confucian thinker he referred to. He's always referred to as a iconoclast, or one of the most significant iconoclasts in traditional China. He can be, I love this audience. I think it's, not everyone must be from China studies if it's this big, though maybe it is the case. But when I speak to him, to my colleagues in religious studies or philosophy, I liken him to someone like David Hume in terms of his significance and the kind of impact he has. And he writes in the 16th century, which is a time, he's called an iconoclast for a good reason. He writes in the 16th century, which is a time period has been referred to as, helpfully, as a period where the cult of Qing, the cult of feelings is influential. And this is a time where spontaneity, at least among the literati, spontaneity, expression of desires, authenticity is celebrated. So he is very much of that kind of time and place. So you can start to imagine what he's like. He's also considered within the Confucian tradition. If you think about him seriously, he then very much broadens, in my view, broadens our view of what is Confucianism. It's not just the Zushi kind, emphasizing rituals and orthodoxy, but this is also Confucianism. So let's begin then. The strategy I've used is, one person refers to this, I think it was Dorothy Cohen, I was reading through her book. She calls it the pile-on, the Confucian pile-on strategy. So this project, it's a in-progress article that's going to be in this volume on Li Zhi we have coming out. And in the article, I do use this pile-on strategy. I think it's even referred to as an obsessive pile-on strategy, which is what Confucians do effectively and powerfully to make their arguments. So I'm not going to pile on all the examples here. I've decided that I'll pick 4, and then I'm going to leave some time. We have till 1:15, is that right? So I'd like to leave some time for questions and see what you think of this, if you're convinced or not. So I'm going to pick out 4 examples for us. And one is I'm looking at terms of art. So he is a writer. He is a Confucian. He takes culture seriously, or Charles Taylor calls it the horizons of significance. So he takes culture seriously, and he manipulates it and redirects our ideas, and he extends certain arguments by way of writing and reading the entire canon, the classical canon. And I'm going to look at how, as a writer, he tweaks terms of art, just 2 of them. And then I want to look at how, as a Confucian, which all Confucians do, he redirects or he extends the vast commentarial tradition. The first one that I want to look at is this letter here. He has 2 books that are most significant. In terms of his collected works, there's 26 volumes right now. It's annotated, but he has a vast number of works. His 2 most famous are called A Book to Burn, Fen Su, and A Book to Hide. And I'm going to be looking mostly at that, though also at a couple of his commentaries on classics. This letter is this comes from a letter. It's about 2 pages in classical Chinese. That's possibly his most famous one on the subject of women. And it's called A Letter in Response to the Claim that Women Are Too Short-Sighted to Understand the Tao. And the letter begins in this way. It says, Li Zhi, and a lot of his writings are letters, back and forth with friends or with other officials. And he writes here, he says, the very beginning of the letter, yesterday I had the opportunity to hear your Li Zhi's correspondence, esteemed teaching, where you proclaimed that women being short-sighted, and that's the term I want to look at, and that's the main thing, duanjian, being short-sighted are incapable of understanding the Tao. And he says, yes, absolutely. Indeed, this is so. Indeed, this is so. And so you're probably looking at this thinking, this is not a very good argument for what you said you were going to argue for, which is Li Zhi is making an argument for women's agency. But what Li Zhi does is he is very much the kind of person, when you read through his essays, he will frame something. He'll sound so conventional, and then all of a sudden he'll change the frame on you, just with one sentence. Or he'll write an entire essay, and the very last sentence changes the frame for you. And he does that here too. So in the next sentence then, he says, this is why. He says, women live within the inner chambers while men wander throughout the world. This is a shorter translation, but those of you who know the Book of Rites, it comes from the BCE classic, the Li Zhi, the Book of Rites. So he's taking that, the Book of Rites is not arguing for women's agency, but he's taking that one line out of context, and he's putting it here, making the argument that, yeah, women are short-sighted. And then he's saying, because of these social practices where women are kept within the inner chambers. So that is a way in which he rereads a classic, sort of inaccurately, but he rereads a classic in a way that argues for women's agency. He's saying women are stuck in the inner chambers. They are literally short-sighted because they're physically see nothing beyond the 4 walls. And he says that later on in the essay. And then he's also, by juxtaposing these lines, making this, I'd say, progressive argument. Okay. Since this is one of his most famous essays, I just want to give you a couple more lines then, just to show you what he does in this essay. He says things like, a person with a woman's body and a man's vision, it may have been in hopes of encountering such a person that the sage Confucius wandered the world, desiring to meet her just once, but unable to find her. And for such a person to be dismissed as a duanjian, a short-sighted creature, isn't this unjust? So he's saying this is what Confucius wanted to find, and now we're saying that they're just essentially short-sighted. There's something wrong with this. He also proposes a method. He says, I propose that those who want to discourse on short and far-sightedness, go ahead, do it, but do it as I have done. You can't just stop at the observation that women's vision is short-sighted. You have to to say that short and farsightedness exists, that's fine. But to say that man's vision is entirely yuanjian, farsighted, and a woman's is wholly short-sighted, now, how can that be acceptable? And he goes on to say we have to actually think about why. So that's one example then from one of his most famous letters. And I want to go on then and look at a second example where he takes a particular term, and it's not obvious, at least it wasn't obvious to me when I read it, that he was doing anything interesting. But then you look at the essay, that line, that sentence, there's something confusing. If you look a little further, I think he's doing something radical or progressive. I guess that's evaluated, but he's doing something in regard to arguing for women's agency. This is from an essay. It's also one of his famous essays. It's his autobiography, and it's very artfully done. It's a wonderful piece. If I only read one piece, I guess I would read his Tongxing Suo on a childlike heart, but this is maybe the second or third most interesting piece of his. He does it, it's really, in my view, really Li Zhi. It's like he hides these arguments in, it seems so subtle and so nuanced, but when you look at it, it's very powerful. Okay, so the essay is called, and it's well known as his autobiography, it's called A Sketch of Zuo Wu, Zuo Wu Lun Yuan. This also is from his A Book to Burn. And we see him, I'm going to say, argue, tweaking a particular term or redefining a particular term in a way that also supports the argument that women, he wants to give women more agency. And that particular term is orphaned, gu. So he says here, he begins his essay, there's several lines, he talks about his different names and what he's referred to as. He returns to the date of his birth, and this is like the end of maybe what you would want to call the second paragraph of this, I think, really fun essay. And he writes, when Li Zhi, when Li Zhi was an infant, his mother, the esteemed Madame Xu, passed away. From a young age, he was orphaned, and nobody knows who raised him. So that doesn't seem like anything so far. Like, how am I going to show that this is an argument for women's agency? But the thing is, if you look to the next line, it says, when Li Zhi reached the age of 7, Sui, so 8 years old, he studied under his father. And so, of course, when I first read this, I thought, there's something wrong with my classical Chinese. It just said he was an orphan, and now it says his father is there alive and studied and held as his teacher. And the thing is, if you start looking through the dictionaries, which is what I did because I thought I had something wrong, so those of you who study early modern China would probably know that, or not, that the character gu, it commonly means to be without a father, even if the mother is still alive. So if your dad has died but your mother is still alive, it is common for you to be called orphaned. So if you look it up in dictionaries, so for example, Zhongwen Da Cidian, the first definition of gu is to be without a father, like I just said. The second and the only other definition of gu with a sense of being orphaned is to be without one's father and mother. So there is no place where I could find a dictionary where it says to be orphaned is to be without one's mother. And the character is rarely, if ever, used in Li Zhi's time with the meaning of a child who is without a mother, but whose father still survives. You can't find it in the dictionaries, or I couldn't. And if you look through his early modern Chinese history, it's never, I've never found, and I talked to other people, I've never found a time when it means, except for here, that the mother is dead, but the father is still alive. This is exactly how Li Zhi uses this term, and I think it's very interesting for our purposes. So Li Zhi's father is clearly alive. You see right here, he's studying under his father. So by referring to Li Zhi as orphaned, in this case, he is doing what he does so well. So he is subtly arguing, making an argument, and sort of hiding it within a text, but not really. So he's subtly, and yet to a remarkable extent, raising the significance of the mother, or at least his mother's influence on the child's life. Li Zhi refers to the motherless younger Li Zhi as orphan, despite the fact that his father still lived. Okay, so those are two examples then of how he transforms words, or redirects words, or redefines words in a way that enables him to argue for women's agency. I want to look now at the commentarial tradition, which is what Confucians do. They add to it, they argue against the earlier commentaries in order to make their points oftentimes. So I want to go back to that letter, a letter in response to the claim that women are too short-sighted, and I want to look at a brief paragraph this time, let's see here, and see how Li Zhi extends or redirects the commentarial tradition. Okay, so we saw the beginning of the essay, and about 2 paragraphs down, this is what Li Zhi says. He says, from our perspective, we can observe the following. He says, Yi Zhang, a woman, so that's a consort of King Wu, filled in the ranks alongside King Wu's 9 ministers. Nothing hindered her counting as one of the 10 able ministers, alongside Zhou, Sao, and Taigong. So just that alone, I think, is helpful for my argument here. And it's simply that he includes Yi Zhang, a woman, and he says she's just as capable in what is traditionally a men's work, so in the work of government, as any of these other 9 men are. So that itself is like pretty good, and I like it, and I think it's useful for our argument. In lines following, which I won't look at here, he speaks of women who are accomplished in writing, Wenmu, and he says she's just as accomplished as the other 4 friends, and she's one of the 4 friends, and they're all men. And he also talks about spiritual enlightenment. He says there's the daughter of Lei Menpeng from the Tang Dynasty. He says she's just as good as attaining enlightenment as men are. So he makes his argument for other realms that are traditionally seen as belonging to those of men. But I want to look now more closely at this passage. Just an initial view is interesting, but I want to look at this further. Okay, so these references to King Wu and his 10 able ministers, this one here, or later on Wenmu and her role as one of the 4 friends, can of course all be traced back to earlier sources, earlier classical texts. And here I want to look at a number of them and look at what they do with the story of, it's a brief story about King Wu and his 10 able ministers that help him defeat a large army. So the texts I want to look at are the Sujing, the Book of Documents, and then I want to look at the Analects. I want to look at 2 commentaries on the Analects, and then I want to look finally and take us to Li Zhi's works and show how brilliant he is. And again, this is what I mean by the pile-on strategy. So we could do this for like so many different parts of Li Zhi, and it's amazing to me how every time, so often you find these gems. Every single time it's sort of like, oh, he's doing this. So this is the first one I want to look at, the first commentary. Nothing, like 4 characters. So King Wu, it's in the Book of Documents. King Wu, it says, while he's the founder of the Zhou dynasty, of course. While outnumbered in a particular battle, he believed he could triumph. Although his opponent, the tyrant Zhou, had hundreds and thousands of men, it says, to fight for him, they were divided in heart and mind, so they were not working together. In contrast, King Wu, as we find in this classic, had this: 10 ministers capable of bringing order. Small in number, but united in heart and spirit. And that's what it says. Interesting to me, because here it just says there are 10 people, 10 able to bring order. There's no mention of a woman here. Li Zhi does say there's 1 woman. So here, 10 men, only men. Later commentators, after the time of the Analects, have suggested that the 10 include Wu's 9 brothers, and there's a lot of debate, and either his consort Yi Zhang or his mother Wenmu. So again, you can look through, and there's like so much discussion on this. In the Book of Documents, though, in this BCE classic, which is the earliest source for the story. There is no mention of a woman among these men. So again, 10, all guys. So if we move forward in historical time to Confucius's Analects, we find, once again, reference to King Wu's 10 ministers, and here explicit reference to a woman. Okay, so we're going to keep on moving forward in time, and sometimes, like, by the end of it, I think it'll be interesting. So we'll, like, bear with me while we go through 3 more commentaries. So in the Analects, in 8.20, it says, King Wu said, I have 10 capable ministers. Confucius said, talent is hard to find. True, is it not? In the time of Yao and Shun, talent flourished, yet Shun had only 5 ministers. As for King Wu's 10 ministers, amongst the 10 was a woman. Okay, so that's good. Amongst the 10 was a woman. So he had 9 and that was all. Okay, so this is like, I think this is worse. So at first it was 10 and now it's like there's 9 plus 1. One of them's a woman, so she doesn't count, so there's only 9. And this is what we find in the Analects. Okay, if we turn to one of the most, and you could do this, you go on, but I just want to show us, I'm going to show you 3 more. If we turn to one of the most widely read and respected commentaries, so if you're looking through the Analects, you want to look for commentaries. This is like one of the most respected ones. It's the He Yan commentary. It's dated to the Wei period. It's a collection. He makes his point by collecting commentaries from others before him. So he cites, He Yan cites Kong An Guo from about 100 Common Era. He dies about 100 Common Era. And Kong An Guo, I suppose this one's, he's just restating what Confucius says. So the point here is a really, like, this is something people want to talk about and they think it's a problem. So in this really famous commentary, they talk about it too, and he just simply restates what Confucius states. And he says, amongst the 10 included one woman. So if you want to read it yourself, it's right there. Amongst the 10 included one woman, so there were really just 9, and that's it. So again, not good. All right. This next one is by Li Zhi, and I think it's one of the most, I think this one's one of the most intriguing ones. So I picked it out for us. It is, besides Li Zhi's, who I think is the most intriguing. So this is by the great Confucian Li Zhi, and in his widely read commentary on the Analects, and surely all of these Li Zhi would have been very familiar with. There's almost no doubt. So this is going to be in Li Zhi's mind. He provides an explanation, I think very interesting, that places Yi Zhang the consort in a different but arguably equally significant sphere of influence as the 9 men. So Li Zhi writes this. He says, 9 people, when I talk to my students about this, they find it so boring until I get to the last one, but so I love giving this talk. Well, anyways, I'll just read this one. 9 people governed the public or outer sphere. Yi Zhang governed the inner. And that's what Li Zhi had to say. So he's explaining that it's separate but equal. There's 9 men. They govern the outer sphere, and Yi Zhang governed the inner. Okay, so with all 10 ministers, the public and the domestic spheres both were ably governed. So unlike in the Mr. He commentary, the He Yan commentary, Li Zhi does not address Confucius's seeming exclusion of the one woman as a minister. Li Zhi he just agrees talent is hard to find. He says, still, King Wu only had such a number, 9 plus 1, or it's ambiguous, but I'm assuming 9 plus 1 of people and no more. Talent is indeed difficult to find. So I say, in summary, his view is something like it's separate but equal. All right, let's look at what Li Zhi has to say again then. So Li Zhi, in his own commentary on Analects 8.20, in his writings, there's a book to burn, a book to hide, lots of essays, mostly letters, poems. He also has lots of commentaries, 26 volumes, a lot of its commentaries on dramas, fiction, and the classics. In his commentary on 8.20, he doesn't say anything. There's nothing there. But if you go back to this letter in response to the claim that women are short-sighted, he does affirm that King Wu's consort Yi Zhang was the 10th minister and indeed served effectively. But he's different than Zhu Xi, and I think in an interesting way, in that he doesn't say she's different. He says, nothing hindered her counting as one of the 10 able ministers. So included and no different. I guess if you're going to put a tag on it, something like equal, something like early liberal feminism or something like this. Like everyone's equal, the sameness equality here, if you're going to put a label on it. Okay. So extracted from the context of the canonical and the commentarial tradition, Li Zhi's given culture and his horizon of significance, his assertion that a king's consort, Yizhang, was a capable minister is already very interesting, and it expands women's roles into the public sphere of government. So for our purposes, helpful, just like interesting to see this, good evidence. But against the larger literary context, this vast commentarial tradition, and we just looked at from the Shangshu and a couple examples through Zhu Xi to Li Zhi, against this vast commentarial tradition, Li Zhi's writing on Yizhang is all the more powerful. Looking through the canon and the commentarial tradition, and moving forward through time, we first read that King Wu's 10 ministers are all male, the Book of Documents, the Sujing. In the Analects, a woman included but considered not really a minister. With Zhu Xi, the woman minister celebrated as different but equal. And then here, if you see that larger context, Li Zhi shows that, or he says, argues that Yizhang is named, he names her, and he describes her as no different than the other 9 male capable ministers. So I think against this larger context, if you read him as a roux, as a scholar would have read him in his time and place, his arguments are so much more powerful even than the initial glance, which is already, to me, interesting. So this passage on the 10 capable ministers is just one example, and we could do this with other parts of his essays and his writings in general. One example of how when we look through the commentarial tradition, with which Li Zhi would no doubt have been very familiar, intimately familiar, we see how clever he is, how skilled, how erudite he is as a writer and as a scholar, and how knowledgeable he is, and how he works up and down and all across the rich and broad literary tradition to claim ground, redirect, or extend the commentarial tradition in service of a larger vision regarding women's agency. So he's working it's not just what's on the paper, he's working all across that vast tradition to reshape it and redirect it, and sometimes intentionally probably, or whatever it is, misread the tradition in the service of his larger vision. Okay. So I want to just give you one more example and then open up to questions. And I want to look at one more example of how Li Zhi uses this commentarial tradition to rework the written world in service of his larger views. And here is Zuo Wenzheng. I want to talk about sort of her story. I want to talk about Sima Qian's Siji, his record of the Grand Historian, and I want to look at Sima Qian's biography on Sima Shangru. So she's later on the wife of Sima Shangru. I want to look at that story, and then Li Zhi provides commentary on Sima Qian's story. So I want to see what he does. What he does is tiny. He provides 2 short sentences. Again, though, by looking, it's sprinkled all the way throughout his writings. If you collect all of that together, I think it's a powerful argument. So I won't say much, but just a few sentences about the historical context, which is always important to Li Zhi. So the historical context is important, the commentarial tradition, that context is important. Here, just a few sentences. Very simply put, we know that the Ming government actively campaigned against widow remarriage. So widow remarriage for the government was a bad thing. However, was practiced, that was what was the legal prescription. And throughout Neo-Confucian writings, we find references advocating widow suicide and condemning widow remarriage. So, for example, we all know Ceng Yi from the 11th century, the famous Neo-Confucian. He writes something like, and we all unfortunately know this well, It is a small matter for a widow and her children to die by starvation, but a calamity for her to lose her integrity and remarry. So we could paint in more of those details, but in short, just the social historical context is a condemnation of widow remarriage, and the idea that you should remain loyal to your husband even if he has died. So in Li Zhi's commentary on Sima Shangru, so Li Zhi's commentary on Sima Qian's book, you find he writes about the young widow Zuo Wenjing who elopes with the later famous Sima Shangru, the Han period poet Sima Shangru. So couched within Sima Qian's lengthy biography on Sima Shangru are just 2 short paragraphs on his elopement with Zuo Wenjing and her father's deep dismay at the news. So in Sima Qian's biography from the Han period, in that famous book, Zuo Wenjing's father reacts to news of the elopement, it says, in a rage. And later, when Sima Shangru attains great fame, the father changes his mind and then does acknowledge that Sima Shangru, he expresses remorse, says, he's so successful, I feel a little bit of remorse. I didn't recognize him as my son-in-law. So Li Zhi responds to these 2 paragraphs from Sima Qian's book. And he responds in his commentary to Sima Qian's biography by saying, in this world today, let's see if I have this. In this world today, those who know of Zuo Wangsun's daughter, Zuo Wenjing, appropriately see her to be a great joy for him. What was he ashamed about? What was his problem? And that's the whole sentence. While Sima Qian writes that Zuo Wangsun's friends agreed that Wenjing had already lost herself in eloping with Sima Shangru, this is the only other thing that Li Zhi writes, but I think really interesting. So Li Zhi, yes, that's my. I was looking for a picture of Zuo Wenjing and Sima Shangru, but this is not historical. This is, I think, like a soap opera of the 2 of them. But they look really happy, which is important to my argument. So he responds, she properly saved herself and did not lose herself. And of course, Sima Qian had said she lost herself. Why did she do this? So 16th century China, and I want to provide a little bit more context for this, literary context. 16th century China, again, we had said, has been helpfully identified in scholarship as a period of a cult of feelings, a time where spontaneity and expression of desires are celebrated. Within this period, so too are companionate marriages, so people have written about this, between those with literary gifts. So that's a celebrated kind of relationship, companionate marriages with those who have the really good writers. So amongst the most, if you look through writings in this time, amongst the most celebrated literary couples, so I don't know if we have this in our time and place, but that's the kind of couples they celebrated, you'll find mentioned three couples are mentioned repeatedly, historical couples. So one would be Empress Zhen and her second husband Cao Pi. That's one couple. The second one is Xu Su and her husband Qing Jia. And the third couple is Zuo Wenjing and Sima Shangru. So those are the couples that are mentioned, like celebrated often in this time and place, in Li Zhi's time. Okay, so of interest in his body of work, he chooses to celebrate Zuo Wenjing and Sima Shangru, who according to lore, and this is why I like this, why this slide is helpful to me, according to lore, they live happily ever after, as a widow she elopes with Sima Shangru. And he does not, to the best of my knowledge when looking through, he does not mention the literary marriages of the former two. And the thing is about the former two, which some of you will know, or many of you will know, is they end really badly for the woman, the other two. So with Empress Zhen, according to some stories, her husband falls out of love with her, and that's okay. But then he demands that she commits suicide. According to others, she was murdered by her romantic rival. So a bad ending for the woman. With Xu Su, she becomes widowed, and she doesn't remarry, and she lives a very hard, impoverished circumstances, a very hard life. So as far as I know, he does not mention those two other very celebrated literary couples. Instead, he mentions Zuo Wenjun and Sima Shangru. So within this cultural context where marriages of literary giftedness is celebrated, whatever his intentions, Li Zhi's intentions, the effect of including and embellishing and choosing to talk about the lives of Zuo Wenjun and Sima Shangru, whose story ends well for the women, would be to, the effect at least, would be to strengthen the view that widow remarriage is indeed a good choice. Okay. So I want to conclude here now and take questions. What we've tried to show today, or what I've tried to show today, is that looking at the writings of one influential Confucian thinker, which is in this case the 16th century thinker Li Zhi, we find, and I'm interested in making this a bigger project. Right now it's looking at this person, Li Zhi. We find one rich and vibrant example of an argument for women's agency that places a premium on the Ru, the scholarly tradition. It places a premium on the world of writing, culture, this culture of ours, where effective strategies for social change are literary strategies attending to the word, the character, the classical references, the commentaries, the genre, the story, the canon. And so all these components of writing is what Li Zhi focuses on. So Li Zhi's views on women's agency, simply bringing women into the world of man, which he seems to, that's what he's arguing for. He's saying, yes, this woman is the 10th of the ministers, and she's just like the other 9 men. So that might seem unimaginative and constitute a limited vision of women's full flourishing, this sort of, I guess, sameness equality. On the other hand, his writings on women reveal one example of what I think is important and interesting of a distinctive and valuable approach to women's agency and social change that's rich with possibility. Rather than, for example, a focus on legal change, the ideals of autonomy and rights, the world of employment, or issues of private and public, we find in Li Zhi a time-honored respect for and a nuanced, powerful understanding of the power of tradition, given and forged through the acts of writing and reading. So even Li Zhi, widely known as an iconoclast in Chinese cultural history, he believed he needed to, or thought he needed to, take his given culture absolutely seriously in order to effectively retrieve and forge a world that enabled women's fullest flourishing. So then what I want to say here then is that in the 16th century thinker, here our example is Li Zhi, we can find, and it's important, and he has something to say, we can find seeds of, or as I've called it, native seeds of change. So thank you. And I'd love to take questions and comments. Yes.
This question reflects my ignorance, but to what extent are these native seeds of change, these Confucian feminisms, drawn upon as resources in the post-imperial period where there's a confrontation with ideas of femininity and rights consciousness that's coming from outside of China, and a sort of search for indigenous roots on which to build something that's authentically Chinese. Are these resources that Chinese feminists in the 20th century were very much in touch with?
Okay, yeah, which is like what I was interested in too. So there's so much superb materials on 20th century Chinese feminisms. And it talks about, and in the past there was literature about how it's borrowed from Western liberal or Enlightenment thinking. But now the view is, well, it's not indebted to Western Enlightenment thinking. There's something special about it itself from the 20th century. That's Chinese. But my view is that it doesn't look back to the Confucian tradition. And so, for example, with this person, He Yingzhen, I was interested in her because I just cursorily looked through it and I thought, actually, she does say things. She talks about the commentarial tradition. She does things that Li Zhi does. And if we don't use this category, and so my argument is it's a useful category, Confucian feminism or native feminisms that go back to a pre-imperial, pre-modern period. if we don't use it, we like don't see what the kind of thing that Li Zhi is doing. We don't see what this person, Heng Zhen, is doing too. So the literature I've seen talks about it as being, in the 20th century, there's so much going on, but my view is that it could do more with thinking, using that category, like looking for, using that category and thereby being able to see the kind of Confucian ideas that you find even in these 20th century thinkers.
Have you found references to Li Zhi in modern materials to make these kinds of arguments?
Let's see. So last time I found something, someone mentioned Li Zhi in this context was Paul Robb. And then he wrote about Li Zhi and Kang Yo Wei, and I haven't for like, yeah, in like more recent literature. Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
The PRC pushed Li Zhi, but not as a Confucian. So they sold the books dirt cheap. China books has been out. But anyway, the quote that I can't remember exactly. It was something like Li Zhi said, 不以孔子之是非，为己之是非. In other words, there's no reason to take the moral standard 是非 of Confucius as your own.
Right.
It seems that it's be hard to call somebody a Confucian if they said something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I think you like gave me comments before, right? On this, you gave me comments before on this. I think.
Well, my job
That
at
was-
the
that was-
conference was
yes.
comment on Hegel. I don't know
Yeah.
if I
No. You also helped me. I think I remember now. You had asked me something about Wu Zetian or something. So I went back and looked it up after you asked me the question. So that's really helpful. Yeah, he has an essay where he says, whatever Confucius says is not like. In fact, you should do the opposite. You should do whatever's in your own heart. Yeah. So like, therefore, how could I possibly call him a Confucian? And I guess we could do the same thing with Wang Yangming, because Wang Yangming says things like, he says, all that stuff, the analects, is just the snot and the drivel and like the stuff that like bad students thought they remembered, and like some of them fell asleep and then they wrote it down anyways, but it's just bad recollection. So Wang Yangming does something like.
The analect is very transformative.
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
He still saw the analect as very transformative. If you read it, you're not a new person, then you can read it correctly.
Right. Yeah. So Wang Yangming does say these things about the analects and then take it seriously at the same time, and I think it's partly it's what some people call therapeutic. Like, just let go. Don't take it so seriously. Like, it's helpful, but you gotta go think for yourself too. And I think Li Zhi is doing something along those lines too, and yeah. And maybe he's a Confucian, and maybe he's not. And I suppose what I would want to argue is it's useful also. Like, I like that view of using a thing, using a theory or a category because it's useful. So it's useful to think of Li Zhi as a Confucian for various reasons. But yeah, he does go all over the place dismissing Confucius. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was just looking at your argument and was trying to think about, so you presented an argument, which gave me the impression that Li Zhi is an iconoclast within the Confucius tradition. He takes up and he accepts the kind of historical comments and arguments about women, but sort of like tweaking it and so giving women agency. But in that regard, his understanding of women's agency as presented in this talk seems to be mostly from a kind of deconstructive point of view. That is like, it's not what you think. But he didn't, or you haven't shown us a kind of how he approaches women's agency from a kind of constructive point of view. That's what a woman is. Like, for example, when I imagine like Juxi's argument, he has a very clear constructive argument of what a woman is. She has a special place and separate but like equal. But so I was wondering, besides the critical part, is there a constructive part to this argument, and how does that link to the code of Qing?
Okay, a great question. In part because I think Li Zhi is often read as someone who takes everything apart, but then does not give you something else, which is already like pretty good. That he can take things apart. But I read Li Zhi as actually he takes things apart and he does create a vision too. So I've argued in some other places that he's putting forth a constructive vision that you need to be true to your own self. So some sense of authenticity. I think here he deconstructs and he criticizes, and you're asking what is he going to give us in place. And I think that what he gives us is he's showing, Zhu Xi says we're separate but equal, something like that. So Li Zhi, I think in his writings, through rewriting the tradition, he keeps on placing women as no different than men. So one example is that, she's just like any of the other 10 able ministers. Or he says something like, Wen Mu was one of the 4 friends. And in the historical context, there was no woman as the 4 friends. But he says Wen Mu was. So I think he's always trying to place women in the same position as a man. Or he's saying like, women's vision is no different than men's. And the only problem is we're stuck in the inner chambers. And so I think that he doesn't explicitly make this argument about, he doesn't describe what a woman is. He doesn't just create a constructive description. But I think that because he rewrites the tradition, he's rewriting it. And if you go read through it, it's this idea that women are just like men. I mean, at least that's how I read it right now. And then I'd say there's a lot of problems with it, with that vision. But I think that's his vision. Yeah.
The story of Goingen
Uh-huh.
not end well for her.
You what?
The story of Goingen
Yeah.
does not end well for her. She puts him through med school, working in the bar, and then he becomes famous, and he sucks up to Emperor Wu, and then he abandons her, and then she writes a famous lament about it. And we don't know if the lament worked. But anyway, it doesn't
Okay.
work out so well for her.
All right. Okay.
But more importantly,
Thank you. Yes.
theater is very closely connected with popular literature,
Mhm.
which is very different for him as opposed to like his competition in the philosophy.
Okay. So like Li Zhi is, he cares a lot about the popular literature, and he uses it to make his arguments.
Right. We know he wrote commentary, but none of it seems to have come down. Commentary on fiction, of course.
Okay, thanks. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask like what Professor Roscoe mentioned, because there's a famous poem called by Hu Ying by Gowen Jing
Uh-huh.
said like she was abandoned after
Uh-huh.
marriage, marry Sima Xiangru,
Uh-huh.
and then she wrote a poem to try to
Uh-huh.
bring back.
Uh-huh.
So what will Li Zhi interpret that kind of story or that poem?
Uh-huh.
And another question of mine is, I wonder, is that Li Zhi quite care about females, or he kind of cares about the entire like equalizing all the human beings? Considering that he's greatly influenced by the Taizhou Xue Pai in the school of mind. So that kind of thing, like the Taizhou Xue Pai argues everyone can be the same. In that sense, maybe he wants to equalize the entire human being, not only to eliminate the distinguish between male, female, civilized, uncivilized.
Yeah. So regarding the first question, I'm going to have to go rethink that last bit of it in that cultural context. But in regard to the equalizing all things, that is what he does. Yes, he does. He says that there's an essay where he says the the parent-child relationship is not the most important relationship. The ruler-subject relationship is not the most important one. And he says instead sometimes he says it's a friend-friend, or he says it's the husband-wife. That's more like a friend. He reforms it as a friend-friend relationship is the most important of the 5 relations. And so I think, and that's another way where he changes the metaphysics. He works within that tradition to make his argument for this larger vision, which in this case is exactly what you say. Something more on, we're all on the same footing, and you should look within your tongxing, your childlike heart. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So you contextualize your main claims here in part by indicating that you want to push back on a dominant reading of 20th century Chinese feminism and its assumption that Chinese feminism has sort of a European Enlightenment heritage by demonstrating that in fact there's kind of Chinese lineage from 20th century feminism as well. And certainly that's an effective way
Mhm,
all, right?
right.
And so far, I'm not seeing that. What
Mhm.
you're talking about in terms of agency and equality is very familiar.
Mhm.
Right? That is,
Mhm.
you demonstrated there are certain
Mhm.
aspects of these writings
Mhm.
that fit within our
Mhm.
kind of liberal enlightenment conceptions of what
Mhm.
feminism might be.
Mhm.
Are you also in
Mhm.
other parts of this work
Mhm.
making claims that this is a feminist tradition with Chinese characteristics in some ways that are distinctive that European feminism could
Yeah,
learn from?
yeah. In fact, yeah. Thanks for that question because I don't think I said very much at all about that. But that is the reason I think it's interesting. So, like, nice. Like, okay, so there's this guy and he says these things about women's agency, and that's all very nice or interesting, and like maybe historically interesting. But I like to think about why it matters in our contemporary discourse. These whatever we're studying from the past, and I think it absolutely has something distinctive to contribute. And it's for example, if you're just going to make cartoons of different kinds of feminisms, he's not a liberal feminist, and he's not a Marxist feminist, and but instead he has something very special to offer, which is he takes tradition seriously, and he's showing us how you can powerfully bring about social change, in this case, women's agency, through writing, or through reading, or through these, and he's so nuanced, because I suppose Confucians are. He's so nuanced in how he reforms a tradition, how he goes back to the old classics, and how he identifies himself as part of a lineage, or how he turns words and redefines them. And he's really skillful and clever, and he'll write something, and then it's just the way he presents his writings is so skillful to you. He starts with something conventional, then you're surprised at the end. So I think just because he adds another very well-crafted sentence or a well-picked-out reference from the past. And so I think, in answer to your question, he does have something very different to offer than what we find in, I guess, the West. And he is a Confucian, so you would expect, and he does, what he has to offer is what a Confucian has to offer, which is like this really understanding the writing tradition and the power of the writing tradition and the reading tradition, and how reading well or writing well can create very powerful social change. So at least that's my argument right now. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much. No more questions? Okay, well, I'll be here, and thank you so much for all your comments, and terribly helpful, and what a great audience. Thank you, and thanks for the invitation.